All right, everybody, thank you for coming. We were gone for a few weeks, so I might be a little rusty as far as the actual content of the book, but I hope we can still have a lively discussion. So today we're talking about Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Now, C.S. Lewis, we read one of his other books before, The Abolition of Man, that I really, really liked a lot, and that was less of a book and more of an essay. But this one was actually even less of a book because it was actually a collection of talks he did over live radio that he then transcribed into book form. And essentially the gist of it was he was asked to market and sort of sell Christianity and Christian doctrine to the English public during sort of tumultuous post-war period in the country. And people thought that maybe returning to a stronger Christian foundation would sort of give people a certain measure of comfort during that time. So he was asked to go on the radio and do that, and this is what came of it. And honestly, it's a very good book. And what I like about C.S. Lewis is actually the fact that he's not very intelligent, and I don't mean that in a harsh way. I mean the fact that he speaks in very, very plain language. And this is one of the things that I think is a mark of a good teacher rather than a good mind, is that the best teachers are actually not all that genius level. You know, they're kind of more that midwit kind of IQ, because they can sort of break down a very complex topic and make it very digestible for someone who isn't exactly a genius. And I think that's exactly what C.S. Lewis is. So I'm not trying to knock him by saying he's not very intelligent. I'm saying he's just sort of he's a man's man. He's one of the common lay people, and he can distill these complex theological arguments down into their core parts and make it very easy to digest for a lay person like us, right? And he does get into some very interesting things, theogony, or what is it, theodicy, like the why evil exists in the world. I think that's what it's called. And things like why we feel a certain sense of morality. And he does this all in a very clear, concise, and entertaining way. He uses plenty of analogies, which is, I think, a very good sign, a sign of a very good teacher. So we can get right into it. I'll start with just some general thoughts. I think this work works best as a counterpoint to atheism. If you were to show this to an atheist, I think they would have a hard time refuting some of the arguments that he makes, even though they are very simplistic. You're not really showing them Thomas Aquinas's proofs of God. No, you're showing him very clear, easy to understand, real world ideas that kind of come across and resonate with people, right? I mean, I think that's the main thing that he tries to do, especially through his use of various analogies. Where I think it probably doesn't shine as much is, why would you choose Christianity over other religions if you are already a religious person? So I think if you are going to look at this as a Muslim or a Hindu, some of the things he says might fall more flat, right? But he basically, the initial part, he gives an excellent reason as to why you should believe in a God and why you should try to live morally to a certain degree. So, that's the strength and the weakness of the book. So with that, I think I'll just get into some passages that I thought were definitely worth talking about. We're probably not going to talk about every single chapter going piece by piece, because it is a fairly long book, but I think you can get some very good thoughts out of this just from a few passages. So this is when he was talking about what he calls natural law, which I thought his description of this natural law, that's a concept that most of us probably understand intrinsically, but it's very, very hard to explain. When I try to explain this, or when many people try to explain this, it just comes off as, well, it's just something that exists, and we know it exists, and we feel it exists, but we can't really articulate it that well. We can't really say, what is the substance of this, and does it even really exist in a concrete sense? Well, I think he actually does sort of prove it exists in a concrete sense with this basic analogy. So he says, think once again of a piano. It has not got two kinds of notes on it, the right notes and the wrong ones. Every single note is a right at one time and wrong at another. The moral law is not any one instinct or set of instinct. It is something which makes a kind of tune, the tune we call goodness or right conduct, by directing the instincts. By the way, the point is of great practical consequence. The most dangerous thing you can do is to take any one impulse of your own nature and set it up as the thing that you ought to follow at all costs. There is not one of them which will not make us into devils if we set it up as an absolute guide. You might not think love of humanity in general was safe, but it is not. If you leave out justice, you will find yourself breaking agreements and faking evidence in trials for the sake of humanity, and become in the end a cruel and treacherous man. And right there is a very good argument against humanism, right? If you just say love of humanity is your baseline moral guide, well, you're going to run into an endless string of contradictions. But back to the piano analogy and how he says you have right and wrong notes. So how can you use this to argue that there is some type of objective morality that exists? Well, he says you often have two you have two impulses and then a third impulse. So to give an example, to preface the example, you can't exclusively say that some people say that morality is just sort of a biological construct, that we develop this morality in a sense to preserve a certain amount of social society and that there is nothing transcendent to it. Well, he kind of combats this line of thinking with the fact that, well, when you are placed in a situation where you have to make, a moral type decision, you don't have two impulses. You actually have this third impulse. So let's think of you're at the beach and you see somebody drowning. Your immediate impulse might be to not save them, to say, I am going to preserve my own life, right, because I see an importance in that. And I'm not going to rush to the water to attempt to save this person. And that might be your immoral impulse. Now you have a second impulse that says, oh, maybe I should rush into the water and save this person because I feel compelled to do that, right? Now, if you actually did feel compelled to do such a thing, then you might say that it is instinctual, that it is biological, that there is something to this that is willing you in this sort of naturally selective way to save the person who is drowning. But, as Lewis says, this is not how it works. Really, you have those two impulses, and then you have a third impulse that tells you to go with the second impulse, because you fully understand that you want to preserve yourself, and you fully understand that you also want to preserve other lives. Why do you settle on the one that ends up being more or less moral? And why do you feel remorse if you were to not save that person? It's because you have a third impulse that is trying to nudge you in the correct direction, right? And this is how you're going to approach most impulsive situations like this. You're going to have this this third kind of conscience that is going to direct you towards the proper action. So you can't say that either of those two actions by itself is moral. The moral is the third impulse, which forces you to choose one of those two outcomes. So it's a very interesting type of argument, and I think it's actually a really easy way to break down this sort of existence of moral law that a lot of people will say does not exist. Well, I think it actually does, because you actually have the will to overpower certain biological impulses. Now, if everything was purely biological, why would you have an override system? Why would you have the ability to go against what your biology wants if we are just purely material biological beings? So I'm going to respond to Funky Times, who says, if morality were merely biological, we'd see all the animals put their lives at risk to save other members of the same species beyond their family. Yet humans are the only species who do so. That's a very good point. I don't know if we're the only species who do so. I mean, every so often you watch those like viral videos. I think those are fake though. A lot of those, like there was one that was like a goat saved a cat or something, and I think that was like an elaborate hoax. But I wouldn't. I think that some creatures might have that impulse. But yes, it is the most prevalent in humans. It's the most obvious in humans, and it really shows that there is something to this line of reasoning. We have this ability to override our certain basic biology that you can't attribute to biology itself. So very interesting thesis right there as to how this moral law could exist. Very interesting. And so he moves on and talks about, so this is what I meant when he talks about the problem of evil, right? This is him talking about how when he was an atheist, because, that's probably important for context. C.S. Lewis was an atheist that eventually converted to Christianity after kind of going through the same thought process that he goes through in this book. So he says, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? How had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? And I think this is a very great line of reasoning against the atheist or the nihilist, right? If they say that there is no such thing as moral good or evil, if they say there is no free will, if they say there is no transcendent morality, well, then and if their reasoning for that is because the world is a bad place, well, how are they getting their understanding of what bad is? How can they call the world a bad place if there is no good or evil? So you have to have some kind of understanding of what the world should be and what you think it should be in order for you to use that line of reasoning to say that the world is not good and that therefore God could not exist. Well, you're kind of destroying your own argument by admitting that there is some qualitative good or evil. And I think this is it's a self-defeating argument, as most of us know, but I think here he says it very well. And so stemming from that, right, you can say that almost because of that, it justifies the existence of a moral law and the existence of a God in itself, right? If you do have an idea of what just and right are, and those ideas are not, they're not in accordance with reality, well, where are you getting this thought of perfection? Well, it has to be something transcendent, something irrational, something beyond. So I like that. I like that section a lot as well. So moving on, and here's another one when he says, why? Another atheist argument, right, is why are humans allowed to commit evil, right? If we have, or if God has some idea of what is good and what is evil and how we are supposed to act, then why are we allowed to commit evil? And he uses a very plain analogy, right? If God is the creator and we are essentially his children or his creations, the easiest way is to think of a parent. So he says a mother. It may be quite sensible for a mother to say to the children, I'm not going to go and make you tidy at the schoolroom every night. You've got to learn to keep it tidy on your own. Then she goes up one night and finds the teddy bear and the ink and the French grammar all lying in the gate. That is against her will. She would prefer the children to be tidy, but on the other hand, it is her will which has left the children free to be untidy. Right? So as a parent, you do not want to have to constantly tell your child how they are supposed to act. You want them to eventually develop the ability to use their free will and act in accordance with rightness on their own. Now, this is a really basic and a very easily understandable argument for why free will exists. Because ultimately, children need to learn and grow, and children need to, they can't just be shuttled down this correct path. They sort of have to find the correct path of their own accord by their own free will. So very good, very easy to understand, very effective analogy, at least in my opinion. And now he says here, going on, he says, 99% of the things you believe are believed on authority. I believe there is such a place as New York. I have not seen it myself. I could not prove by abstract reasoning that there must be such a place. I believe it because reliable people have told me so. The ordinary man believes in the solar system, atoms, evolution, and the circulation of the blood on authority, because the scientists say so. Every historical statement in the world is believed on authority. And this is something that people really tend to forget as we live in the 21st century, that they will look down upon things like the Bible or any type of religious teaching and say that you're just going to take that on authority. Well, like he says right here, 99% of the things you take on explicit authority, which is, there's two lines of reasoning you could go with this. One is you should be questioning of all authority, right? And that means even the scientific authority. That means if you can't empirically test some of these things for yourself, you should be skeptical. On the other hand, it says you should be you shouldn't just write off something just because it is being said authoritatively, right? Because if we just denied every single thing that was told to us based on authority, well, we wouldn't be able to live our lives, right? I mean, you sort of take plenty of things for granted. You take for granted that your water is going to be clean and drinkable. If you were going to refuse to take that authority, well, then you would you would thirst to death, I guess. So things like that. And then this is sort of you see this a lot today. This is a really good argument against scientism, and you'll see even there's a very excellent It's Always Sunny clip that was going around and to combat some of these scientist types. So I don't know if you guys watch It's Always Sunny, but there was an episode where Mac is arguing for evolution against he was arguing for creationism over evolution, and he says that if you're just going to take this idea of evolution from a bunch of old men that you've never met and just take their authority and their research that you haven't seen, if you haven't seen the fossil record, if you haven't done the research yourself, you're literally taking on authority. It's no different than if you were to just believe the Bible, right? So there really isn't that much that we can know 100% empirically as an individual. You sort of have to take a certain amount on faith. So if you're unwilling to take things like the Bible on faith, well, that's not really a consistent argument, because you're taking most of the information you have in your entire life on faith. So then Funky chiming in again, he says, his favorite quote was, "Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. A world of automata or creatures that work like a machine would hardly be worth creating." 100% true. And I probably didn't highlight that, because it is kind of one of those things that once it's written down, it's extremely obvious. Like it doesn't sound all that groundbreaking, but it really is 100% true. You have to realize that anybody who's going to be upset about the existence of evil, you have to realize that the fact that evil does exist is what kind of allows life to flourish, right? Unless you have some antithesis to good, the good is more or less meaningless. So yeah, very, very good stuff. So moving on. Okay, gotta get to my notes. Using the Kindle, it always messes me up. All right, where are we at? Oh, here's a good one. So when you had a whole chapter devoted to talking about different virtues, and had one talking about the virtue of temperance, and he says it's it's misleading that temperance in popular nomenclature has sort of come to mean temperance regarding alcohol, right? So if you have the temperance movement, it means you're trying to ban alcohol, you're trying to be a prohibitionist. Now, is that the only thing worth being temperate about? He says, of course not. He says it just happens to be one of the easiest things to fall victim to. But he has a good section right here. He says, a man who makes his golf or his motor bicycle the center of his life or a woman who devotes all of her thoughts to clothes or bridge or her dog is being just as intemperate as someone who gets drunk every evening. Of course, it does not show on the outside so easily. Bridge mania or golf mania do not make you fall down in the middle of the road. So people forget that temperance regarding all things is fairly important. If you're going to be obsessive regarding anything in your life so much that it is actually to your own detriment, then that is, sinful. That is evil to a degree. So when you think of just not doing drugs or not doing alcohol or those things being sinful, well, overeating is also sinful. If you're going to be, eating so much that it is to the detriment of your life, well, now you are participating in a certain amount of self-destruction, which is evil, right? And then Siddhartha chiming in, he says, I think about it kind of like heat. The existence of thermal energy implies that heat and cold both exist. Life implies both good and evil. So yeah, and it's okay if you miss your window, because, we can always go back to other things. I would rather hear more of your thoughts than less. So so you could definitely think of evil as hot and cold, right? So good and evil, hot and cold, that one cannot exist without the other. And you see that with most dualities, the dualities of the universe. And you would never, in the same way you would never appreciate a sunny day if you never had rainy days, right? And the fact that you can have sunny days sometimes does make you appreciate a rainy day as well sometimes. But then back on that, on temperance, I guess the main thing there is people need to understand that they do need to exert a certain amount of temperance in all areas of their life, not just with respect to what you put in your body, but with what you spend your time doing. And I think many people in this generation, they have that problem with video games. They don't think of something like video games being legitimately sinful, but if it is, leading to self-destruction, then that is, once again, self-destruction is a form of sin, it is a form of evil. And if you're going to video game so much that is destroying your relationships, interfering with your schooling, not allowing you to work, then yeah, I think you definitely have a problem in the same way that an alcoholic does. And it's actually, I don't think I highlighted a quote from this, but he had a very interesting quote on sexuality, actually, and as far as how sexualized society is. And he says that people tend to think the Christian views on sexuality as being oppressive and repressive, and saying that all sexuality is bad. Well, they don't say that. And he uses the basic analogy that if you had a society, you go to an island colony that is untouched, and you saw that these people had a club where the lights are dark, and you walk in, and at the center of the stage is a curtain, and the curtain slowly opens up to reveal a steak, and these people are mouth-watering in the crowd looking at this steak. You might say that these people have a extremely unhealthy relationship with food, that they have really taken this basic biological drive and taken it to a very unhealthy extreme, right? If they are just looking at food and their mouth is watering, then their ideas of food and their ideas of a basic biological process are very skewed and very out of line with what is good and healthy. And he says it's the same thing with sexuality. People say you can't look down upon sexuality because it is a natural biological process. Well, once again, so is eating, and plenty of people take eating too far and are very self-destructive and just unhealthy with it, right? In the same way, sexuality, Christianity doesn't say that sex is bad, right? You need to have sex, you need to procreate, but it says that, once you have a society that is going to put too much emphasis on sex and is going to become, sort of a slave to sex and sort of totally have this unhealthy relationship and this, you might even say, dependence on it, you have reached this total extreme that is going to be self-destructive to the detriment of the individual and society. And a lot of people have trouble understanding that. They can only see in a paradigm of sex being good or bad. Well, it can be good insofar as certain criteria are met, and is going to be bad insofar as it's taken to an extreme. Right? I mean, it's really not too hard to understand, but once again, he says it in a very clear way, and I think that food analogy was right on the money. And so here he has an interesting section where he talks about the Christian idea to sort of recreate society, and what naturally, if you are a Christian, you want to shape society in a Christian image, right? Create a Christian society. Now, what exactly does that mean, and what would a Christian society will look like? And he actually says something that I thought was quite funny. So he says, if there were such a society in existence, you or I visited it, I think we should come away with a curious impression. We should feel that its economic life was very socialistic and, in that sense, advanced, and that its family life and its code of manners were rather old-fashioned, perhaps even ceremonious and aristocratic. So, he's saying that essentially the Christian society is socially conservative and fiscally liberal. The exact opposite of what you see from modern conservative movements today, right? Which just proves how anti-Christian they have become. And to a certain degree, this might be overstated. You have plenty of people say, oh, well, Jesus was a communist. It's like, okay, well, not necessarily. I mean, there's a difference between communism and having a certain amount of welfare and distribution to people who are going to do good with it, right? But more importantly, this idea of leftist economic policy is sort of meaningless if your society is not healthy and if your society does not have morality, which is the more important aspect, right? And this is the thing that both modern left and right have totally abandoned, which is an idea of, an actual morally centered, traditional-ish society. And this is what the true Christian society looks like. And you have too many modern Christians, Christians in name only, that are going to focus on these less unsavory aspects, and say, oh, actually, Christianity is about never judging people and giving all your money away. Well, no, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And if you really wanted to shape a society that was in a Christian image, this is what it would look like. It would be the opposite of the socially liberal, fiscally conservative society that too many conservatives today claim to espouse. And then so Funky Time says, it's all about agency. Leftism assumes individuals have little agency. Christianity assumes the opposite. Yeah, that's actually a good point there. Well, actually, we could spend a whole lot of time talking about just that point. I mean, talking about how, and I think I've talked about this before, you have certain ideas of how much does this blank slate exist, and, this liberal type of viewpoint that all people are sort of born innocent and that everything that they do is a product of their environment, right? They sort of totally remove this idea of human agency that I think is much more prevalent in the conservative traditionalist mindset. Wasn't your essay on agency also based around a C.S. Lewis book? Yes, very much so. So I think Abolition of Man is, he really does go into that, this idea of agency. Because, I don't want to reiterate everything, but I could spend probably a whole nother video talking about Abolition of Man, because that's such a great essay. But essentially, yes, he is very aware of this sort of removal of agency that comes with this liberal leftist framework. So, all right, moving on from there. What do you say? Oh, so this is kind of interesting. So he says, talking about judgment. So, actually, I'm going to preface this one. So he's sort of talking about, what it means to sort of love your neighbor and how to go about judging them versus not judging them. So he says here, that is why Christians are told not to judge. We see only the results which a man's choices make out of his raw material, but God does not judge him on the raw material at all, but on what he has done with it. So, and I think he sort of uses this partially to refute the idea that you have plenty of atheist types that will say, well, if Christianity is truth and if Christianity is the way and Christianity leads to goodness, why are there so many evil Christians out there and moral atheists? Well, he says, every person is not equal. Every person does not have the same starting point. You have not seen the Christian person without Christianity. Perhaps they're even more of a despicable, awful person. And perhaps that atheist, is just a naturally good person, and you haven't seen them what they could be if they did have Christian morality, right? But then going even further from that, he says, how do we judge people? Well, you can't judge everybody by the same standard, because everybody is different, and what exactly are they given, and this is where the sort of you come to kind of balance between agency versus lack of agency, right? Because there is a certain amount of, if a person is, raped and abused as a child for, years of their childhood, and they have psychopathic tendencies, that person behaving in a good moral way, they have a much lower standard for what is good and moral than a person who had a very good, healthy upbringing, right? So it's more about progress, and it's more about making those decisions that lead to an overall good character. Because the next paragraph, there's this one, he says, people often think of Christian morality as a kind of bargain in which God says, if you keep a lot of the rules, I'll reward you, and if you don't, I'll do the other thing. I do not think that is the best way of looking at it. I would much rather say that every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. So this is what he means. You kind of have a soul, and whether that soul starts off better or worse, more more pure and innocent, or more hardened and psychopathic, that is less relevant than how your soul changes, right? If you're a good person, but then continue to do a series of immoral acts, your soul has become blacker. And if you are a person with a very, harsh psychopathic soul, and you perform a series of good acts, your soul has become more pure, right? So there is no point of no return. There's always movement towards creating a better character, right? And I think there's some old adage, it's like, be wary of your thoughts, they turn into actions. Be wary of your actions, they turn into habits. Be wary of your habits, they become your character. And I think that is very true as far as how Christianity views character and the soul, right? It's about a series of positive or negative actions that eventually shape an overall picture of your soul. So once again, it's not like if you sin one time, you're going to hell. Well, it's about which direction you're headed in. It's about, whether you're headed down a better or worse path at any given moment. Siddhartha says, the wheel of karma, reap what you sow, very much so. Receive what you give and what not. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. A lot of this stuff it almost comes off as a bit cliche, but sometimes cliches are cliche for a reason. Sometimes these axioms are axiomatic by virtue of reality. It's because that's how real life is. That's why things are this way. And that's what's so good about it, is because it doesn't rely on, lofty theology. It really relies on, these really easy to understand analogies and adages and things like that. All right, then I think I had one or two more notes I wanted to go into. Sorry, that one. Oh, actually, I have three more. Sorry, guys. So he says, this is a really interesting one when he talks about loving thy neighbor and how you're supposed to love your neighbor, right? Or love your enemy, right? He says, what does it mean to love your enemy? How can that be a tenet of Christianity? So he says, for a long time I used to think that this is a silly, straw-splitting distinction. How could you hate what a man did and not hate the man? But years later it occurred to me that there was one man to whom I had been doing this all of my life, namely myself. And I think this is a very good, kind of eye-opening kind of statement. You understand that you are not a perfect person. You understand that you have done plenty of things in your life that are not good. You've probably hurt other people, yet you usually have a much easier time forgiving yourself than you have forgiving other people, and perhaps that's a certain degree of treat others the way you want to be treated. Well, maybe that means you can forgive a certain person for their actions despite the fact that you hated their actions. They said hate the action, hate the sin, not the sinner, right? You can look upon the actions of a person as totally immoral and even hate those actions, but you can sort of look past that and understand that there's a flawed person underneath that is still capable of being loved. And what he says here is the fact that if you have a very hard time with that, if you can't really love a person who is always failing and always sinning, you could say, well, look at yourself. Are you perfect? Have you never sinned before? Well, do you still forgive yourself? Do you still love yourself? Well, then just use that same type of line of thinking with other people. There you go. Now you can start forgiving people. Easy as that. And then here's another one when he talks about, so the question is, does loving your enemy mean not punishing him? And he says this is totally wrong, right? Because obviously we still need to have a certain amount of punitive justice. And even things like war, right? War against an enemy, you can, so he even says, loving your enemy does not mean never going to war with them, because sometimes that's very necessary. And a lot of people point to the Ten Commandments and they'll say, thou shalt not kill. Well, he says there are two Greek words, the ordinary word to kill and the other word is to murder. When Christ quotes that commandment, he uses the murder in all three accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this is another thing similar to what we talked about in Schmidt, is you have these certain bastardizations of these Bible verses due to mistranslation, right? I would think that the idea of kill versus murder is very, very different. There's a large nuance there, and that's how things like this get corrupted. So we have to remember that we're reading a translation of a translation in most cases. So you need to use a little bit of common sense when you're reading these things, right? I mean, there's absolutely, you can't really, can't really say that there's never a point where there's never a point where you would need to kill. Obviously, there's points where you need to kill, right? If somebody's going on a genocidal rampage, trying to kill every single person in the world, the immoral thing would be to not stop them, right? I mean, that's just obvious. You shouldn't need to say that. But then some people just look at things like, oh, well, it says thou shalt not kill, so we can't kill. Well, no, you're just being an idiot. So that was another interesting part. So Funky Time says, the modern understanding of pride being a sin has also been completely distorted, maybe due to misunderstanding and linguistic translation. Pride in your own accomplishments is okay, assuming this pride does not come from a position of putting yourself above God. You can be proud of yourself as long as you acknowledge that your accomplishments would be impossible without God. Atheists falsely assume that considering pride a sin means to constantly hate yourself. Well, and honestly, you could say that about every single one of the so-called deadly sins. And I think this is something that nobody understands. It's something, well, pride is an obvious one. It's good to have pride, right? It's bad to be arrogant, and it's bad to be proud for the sake of being proud, right? You should be proud in something worth being proud of. But in the same sense, if you have no pride, if you're the most humble person, you have no self-confidence, you're hardly even a human being at that point. You're hardly a man. In the same way you can look at any of these. Look at something like lust, right? If lust is a deadly sin, does that mean that you're not allowed to lust over your wife? Does that mean you're not allowed to procreate? No, obviously it doesn't mean that. It just means, Siddhartha says it perfectly. The 7 sins are a mirror to the 7 virtues. Almost to be virtuous, you need to sort of hold temperance within those 7 deadly sins, right? Gluttony is a sin. Does that mean you're not allowed to eat? No, because you would die. What else? Envy is a sin. Does that mean you're not allowed to look upon the accomplishments of others and want to emulate them? You're not allowed to look at someone else's example and want to improve yourself based on that example? No, you need to have a modicum of envy in order to improve yourself, right? All of these things are sort of necessary. They only become deadly when taken to an extreme. Very interesting stuff, and that's another thing you could probably spend a whole hour talking about just in itself. All right, so one more note. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Very interesting and profound quote. So he talks about this idea that creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. So he says, a baby feels hunger. Well, there is such thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex, right? And then so if you have this desire to go beyond, this desire to find something outside of the material world, then does that desire exist inorganically? Does it exist despite the fact that there is no cure? No. Logic would tell us that if there is a desire, there has to be something to satisfy it. Therefore, if you look historically, almost every civilization, across the world, every single people from primitive to modern has had some concept of religion. Is this just coincidence? Is this just, mass psychology? Or does it point to the fact that maybe humans are naturally religious because it is a natural drive that is going to be fulfilled by something very much real, something that exists and is out there, that is immaterial, something that is transcendent, something that is not perfectly rational. And this is, ultimately a very good argument, once again, for why you should be, why you should be religious. Are you going to just reject that desire? Or are you going to do your best to become a nihilist who believes in nothing? Or are you going to truly consider the fact that there could be something out there beyond what is, what you can touch, smell, see, and hear? So that was the last quote that I thought was interesting, and I think you have a good gist of, what he talks about in this book, and why I find it interesting, why I find it useful. It's an easy read. I recommend this for everybody. If you haven't actually read the book yet, even if you're not a Christian, I would say give it a shot, because he says some things in here that are just, plain interesting on how to live a good moral life, and I think that could be applicable to, people of all religions, right? So I don't know if you guys have anything you'd like to say. I will open up the phone lines. Let's see, where do I go? Okay. Currently in the place. So, yeah, if you want to come in. What else was I going to say? Yeah, so we took a few weeks off. I was really busy. I didn't really have time to read it all. But starting today or tomorrow, we're going to be reading Nihilism by Seraphim Rose. The full book is not called Nihilism. I forget what the subtitle is. It's called The Root of Revolution. Yes, The Root of Revolution in the Modern Age by Seraphim Rose. Really interesting sounding book. Keith Woods actually did a video on this book, which is what turned me and many others onto it. It looks really interesting. Gonna have some really cool things to discuss in that one. I hope it's good. So yeah, if anybody has any final thoughts, I will stick around. But otherwise, doesn't look like anybody is hopping into the voice. So yeah, I guess I will wrap up the recording here at least.